today. I really appreciate you all being here. And my name is Grace Martin. I'm a graduate student here in the School of Music with my emphasis in piano performance and pedagogy. The goal of my lecture today, slide, will be to discuss the reasons that improvisation should be reintegrated into classical piano teaching due to both its potential to boost important cognitive aspects of musical performance, like anxiety management and creative capacity, as well as due to its historic and artistic precedence. First, I want to specify how I'll be using the term improvisation in this lecture. By this word here, I mean the ability to invent music on the spot that has not been previously notated in that particular way, whether that is largely from scratch, which would be in the case of free improvisation, or whether it's built off of a pre-existing sort of skeletal structure, or maybe even embellishing an already written piece. All of those for this lecture count as improvisation. I also want to emphasize that this is an ability that can be taught. It is not in any way by necessity an inborn skill or talent, although talent can help. Second, I want to clarify that many musicians on the piano still learn to improvise, and that improvisation is alive and well in many other genres like pop, jazz, country, folk music, but this is not the case for most classical piano players and their experience. I was fortunate personally to get started on improvisation in middle school when my classical piano teacher taught me how to read basic lead sheet notation so I could play in church. I later had the opportunity to study jazz piano in college here and at the university, at St. Olaf College and here at the University of Idaho. So through my years studying and working as a musician, I found the skills I can employ due to having this experience of improvisation have been a huge asset, both in surviving tricky professional experiences and performance situations, as well as just expressing myself at the instrument and finding a deeper fulfillment at the piano. So in pursuing this topic, I just really wanted to find a way to combine both my passion for classical repertoire and the freedom of self-expression that improvisation brings, which I've experienced in jazz and other styles. So for this presentation specifically, I want to focus on how to develop this tool within the genre of classical piano specifically. I will begin with a brief overview of the history of improvisation in classical music, then discuss the neurological benefits of improvising, and finally finish the presentation with practical steps and approaches for classical piano teachers and performers to integrate this into their own practice. All right, so first, the historic precedent. Improvisation has played a key role throughout the history of classical music in the West. The disconnect we see today between the classical pianist and the art of improvisation and composition and performance really only came about in the late 19th century. We can be confident improvisation was a technique used on keyboard instruments beginning as late as 1706 with Monteverdi's L'Orfeo opera, but it's likely to have been used even earlier, potentially at the end of the 16th century. Later on, in the Baroque and classical eras, although figured bass gradually fell out of favor, the use of embellishment and ornamentation on repeats of sections, especially obvious in dance movements, became commonplace. This gave the performer the opportunity to create novelty in every performance and really express their own artistic ideas in these variations. Then further on in the classical era, the creation of one's own cadenzas for the end of a sonata or concerto became commonplace, as well as the process of improvising your own prelude before the main work. You've probably heard of the great virtuosos who could improvise this way, like J.S. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, and Liszt, to name a few. However, I want to emphasize that this performance practice was not exclusive to masters of this era, but was seen as a commonplace skill in the time. In addition to the stories of the greats, we can see evidence for the normalcy of improvisation in performance in the classical and Baroque eras through the existence of many treatises and teaching tools on the topic. For example, in C.P.E. Bach's essay on the true art of keyboard playing, he includes a detailed chapter on how to begin one's own fantasy or prelude, beginning with a good basso continuo and building it up from there. And through this chapter, he explores many concepts such as ways to stylistically modulate, what keys would be more interesting or what would be more normal to modulate to, and other stylistic approaches, as well as ideas for figuration and texture. And then in addition to that, Karl Czerny, famous for his many etudes and finger exercises, wrote an extensive work on the process of improvisation titled A Systematic Introduction to the Art of Improvisation, which includes a really interesting section called The Art of Preluding, where Czerny actually wrote out numerous examples of ways to structure a prelude, different textual and formal options, and possible modulations to employ. And I actually want to show that to you right now because I think it's just that interesting. Let me pull it up here. Here. He starts here with showing some basic harmonic structures, how you can move from the dominant to the tonic in all these different keys of just a simple way to voice that in the right hand and doing octaves of the root in the bass. And then down here, he's gone on to show slightly more complicated, he says rather longer preludes, which may be transposed into all the other keys. So these are slightly more elongated and complex forms. And I'm going to actually come back to these later in the demo section. Then he gets in here to some examples of figuration you can do. So different textures, different ways to arpeggiate things. Some involving both hands. You can also do just the left hand playing bass notes while the right hand does these figurations. So this is a really interesting jumping off place. And so both of these works give us ideas as well of not just the commonplace nature of this practice at the time, but also what would be considered stylistically appropriate for that. Right. So in the course of my research, I got really curious about the rift that has developed between performers of this music and improvisation compared with where it once was. There are some really interesting theories addressing how and why this happened, and a lot of it really centers around various phenomena that increased our ability to judge ourselves as performers and put ourselves to higher and higher standards of perfection and compare ourselves with one another, which are really incongruous with the comfort that we need to participate in the risky business of inventing music on the spot. One factor for the drop in improvisation was actually the rise in piano study. As the middle class grew, more and more amateur musicians could afford pianos, which led to a greater demand in sheet music. Musicians of this level, however, had less time to become proficient in the art of producing things like cadenzas themselves, and were therefore more reliant on the composer to provide one with the larger work already pre-composed. Thus, playing this pre-composed cadenza became much more common. Then, with the ongoing development of recording technologies, from gramophone to records to CDs to the amazing technology we have today and the ability to splice videos together with multiple takes, we have this increasingly high level of demand for an immaculate production of famous works, which leads to a deeper sense of the need for perfection in performance in order to even begin to stand up and measure up to this standard. The rise in music institutions and competitions also fan these flames of perfectionism, as now we're comparing ourselves with others in adjudicated settings for prizes and positions at prestigious schools. Then, following the boom in recording access came the historic performance movement, where musicians tried more than ever to recreate the exact original sound of the pieces of the Baroque and classical canon, thus pushing the genre more and more to be about perfect replication over personal expression. To quote Nare Sol, a Korean-American contemporary classical performer and composer, spontaneous improvisation cannot occur in music, which is intended to be more a replication of music of the 1790s than of a musical event today. In this kind of artistic space, improvisation becomes very risky and in some cases frowned upon. I should mention, however, that there has been some degree of revival in improvisation in the classical world. You may have heard of Robert Levin, well known for his skill at both completing unfinished works by Bach and Mozart, as well as improvising his own cadenzas and sonatas for his performances of Mozart and Beethoven works. Additionally, world-renowned Venezuelan pianist Gabriela Montero has had great success in improvising for her audiences using themes they request ahead of time. So now that we've briefly covered historic precedent of improvisation in classical music, I'd like to discuss the cognitive benefits possible from reincorporating this practice into your own teaching or piano study. Okay, so first I want to discuss how exposure to improvisation can help students manage performance anxiety, something which I know from personal experience plagues many students and even professional performers. A study by Robert Allen explored if beginning a performance with free improvisation exercises could help alleviate some stage fright in young students. So for the experiment, the researcher had the control group perform a prepared piece of classical repertoire from memory, while the experimental group began with a free improvisation activity on stage before beginning their classical repertoire. Then after the performance, the students reported their anxiety levels through Spielberg's State Trait Anxiety Inventory and the Children and Musical Anxiety Report Scale. Overall, the students who began with free improvisation reported lower rates of performance anxiety than the students who only performed repertoire. Allen hypothesizes that these results could be due to the fact that performance anxiety is largely rooted in a sense of self-judgment or the fear of others' judgment on your performance. However, when students do free improvisation, they can feel secure that there are no wrong notes, and through that dismiss many expectations and pressures that they place upon themselves. In addition to this study, an fMRI scan studied by Anasari and Berkowitz found that the areas of the brain that process new stimuli or distractions seem to shut down during improvisation. And this corroborates the findings of Allen that students who did the free improvisation first seemed to have better focus and also resistance to memory slips after the procedure. Right. So free improvisation has also been used as a tool to lessen performance anxiety in the music therapy world. Known here as Music Therapy Improvisation Desensitization Protocol, or MTIDP, practitioners combine live improvised music with desensitization training, thus allowing for creative expression in the process. To explore the effectiveness of this tool compared with other music therapy methods on treating anxiety, researcher Yongshin Kim organized a study with 30 college-level pianists who struggled with performance anxiety. Half of them did improvisation-assisted desensitization, while the others used progressive muscle relaxation technique and imagery with music. The results suggested that PMR and improvisation were roughly equally useful at reducing stress based on their measuring tactics. The students also expressed afterwards that it helped them to feel more comfortable at the instrument overall, although for some, the experience was a bit jarring because they'd played piano for 20 years and had never tried improvising before. So that was something to get used to. Still really interesting. Next, I want to discuss some research that supports the potential of improvisation to develop a musician's capacity for creativity and self-expression. First, there are really few interesting fMRI scan studies that offer some fascinating information on what parts of our brain are exercised during improvisation and how these parallel with other activities. Researchers Lim and Braun took scans of the brains of jazz musicians improvising, as well as the same musicians playing scales to compare the activity each. So one improvised activity and one sort of from memory pre-learned activity. It turned out that during improvisation, the area of the brain that handles biographical information and self-expression was much more activated than in performing from memory. Additionally, they found there was deactivation in the region of the brain that handles self-consciousness inhibition and sort of like our filtering area. So both of these areas, then they're right here in the prefrontal cortex, so that highlighted area. To quote the discussion at the end of the article, in short, music creativity vis-a-vis improvisation may be a result of the combination of intentional, internally generated self-expression with the suspension of self-monitoring and related processes that typically regulate conscious control of goal-directed, predictable, or planned actions. So making time to practice the art of improvisation can help open your mind for this kind of thinking as a process of shutting down one region that self-filters and awakening the region that self-expresses is exercised. It's also interesting to note that in another study by Lopez, Gonzalez, Lim, and Braun, they found areas activated during improvisation that also controlled language and sensory motor skills. This makes a lot of sense related to how music is so communicative and functions so similarly to spoken language. All right, so if improvising works the parts of the brain that self-express and lessens activity in the areas that filter, you could then ask if there is a marked measurable difference in ability for creative thought between improvising and non-improvising musicians. To explore this concept, Kleinmetz and colleagues administered a variety of creativity tests to improvising musicians, non-improvising musicians, and non-musicians to compare if one group seemed to score higher on creativity standards. Here, they define creativity by the volume of ideas produced within this activity, as well as the statistical rarity of those ideas. So fluency, number of ideas, and then originality, uniqueness. The premise for this experiment was roughly that our minds have two phases in the process of creative thinking. First, the generation phase, where we come up with ideas, and then the evaluation phase, where we sort these ideas out. The researchers theorized that improvising musicians may be more creative because they spend more time developing their ability to generate ideas, while classical musicians largely focus on evaluation and critique of the ideas. It turned out that the improvising musicians had the highest level of creativity according to their definition, while non-improvisers and non-musicians actually had very similar scores of creativity. It concluded this difference occurred between the two categories of musicians, potentially because classical musicians had an overdeveloped evaluation phase as a result of the way they approach their music and practice, that the intense focus on self-critique within classical training can lead to sort of atrophy the ability of the mind to have divergent ideas, have these new ideas, and then not immediately label them as dangerous, which is a very necessary process for coming up with continuous new ideas and new innovations. Of course, as many of us in the room are classical musicians, we know that this is not true that we are completely void of creativity in our performances and our practice. It's not what I'm trying to say. But it may be the case that we're given less space and permission to exercise this muscle in our artistic process. The researchers described this reality in their study, explaining that the difference between mainstream classical study and jazz is that jazz musicians are able to manipulate the primary parameters of music, like harmony, rhythm, melody, as well as secondary parameters like tone, volume, phrasing, and time, while classical musicians tend to only work on those secondary parameters, although with extreme detail and precision. If we can allow for more improvisation in our practice as classical pianists, then we can foster growth in the idea generation phase of our creative thought process. All right, so let's talk about some of the ramifications that could happen from doing more improvisation as a classical musician. These could include greater ability to avoid the pitfalls of performance anxiety and staying more focused, and ability to recover and make your way out of memory slips, which I have definitely improvised my way out before. It can be really helpful to have that in your back pocket. The opportunity to exercise your cognitive faculties that are used in creative thought and self-expression, and overall to develop a sense of comfort in artistic risk-taking in your performance. On more technical levels, we can also leverage improvisation to be a playground for our students to apply technique and theory that they're studying, like scales, arpeggios, stop chord progressions, and more. Furthermore, by experimenting with these forms, figures, structures, and harmonic progressions themselves, students will become much more attuned to quickly recognize these patterns when processing new pieces of music, which can greatly increase their speed of learning repertoire and sight reading. By allowing and normalizing improvisation in the lesson and practice time, we can also help students and ourselves to develop a greater sense of self-confidence as an artist and to take real ownership over the trajectory of our music study by helping them understand the role that they play in creating the music and also what kinds of sounds move, excite, and interest them. This practice can really become a great on-ramp as well for any students interested in composition, thus helping rebuild that bridge between the performer and composer that was much more present in previous centuries. All right, so now the time you've all been waiting for. How do we teach improvisation in a classical piano setting? What does this look like? What would those activities be? So before we dive into that, I want to go over some general guidelines. First, again, there is no natural talent required to improvise. We're not born necessarily knowing how to improvise well, just like we aren't born knowing how to play piano well. It's something that can very much be learned and trained. Second, I want to go through kind of the three main categories I'd split this up into. So first, we have sort of exploratory improvisation, where you assign parameters for the student to work within. So maybe you say, okay, we're going to play on all black keys. We're going to play all white keys. We're going to play this rhythmic motif over and over again. Or we're going to go between the 1 chord and the 5 chord over it. So you set these parameters and then they explore within those. Second, you can get into more compositional practices where it's like, okay, we're going to build a chord progression and then we're going to improvise our way through it. So you're starting to build larger structures, and this is how you would come up with a prelude that maybe could be used before a memorized repertoire piece in a recital, and things like that. or toccatas, cadenzas, theme and variations, or other options. And finally, there's just embellishment and ornamentation, which is very much a part of the Baroque performance practice, and I even got to learn about it here in Dr. McVeigh's class. And that would be you're still playing off of an actual notated piece, but you're adding a lot into what is there. You're kind of using it as a skeleton and filling in notes in between and adding ornaments and things like that. So those are the three kind of categories I would think about within teaching improvisation in a classical setting. All right. Where'd scenario one go? It's over there. Okay. So, all right, so let's start with scenario one. So I'm going to build from beginner to intermediate to advanced for this. So let's say you have a 6-year-old piano student. She's comfortable doing 5 finger scales. She's in about the first method book, about finished with that. And you're trying to introduce the concept of eighth notes versus quarter notes. Actually, would anyone like to volunteer to be my 6-year-old student right now? Okay, thank you, Zon. All right, okay, have a nice long bench. All right, so Zon, yeah, go ahead and sit. Just get down a bit because I'm gonna play with you. Okay, great. All right, so can you play 2 eighth notes and a quarter note for me on C?
2 eighth notes.
So 2 eighth notes and then 1 quarter note. I'll show you first. So like this. You do just that. Good. Now can you do that on a different key? Any other white key? Perfect. Okay. Now can you pick one more white key? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play an accompaniment with you, and while I play this, I want you to keep picking white keys and playing that rhythm on there. Okay?
Okay.
So 1, 2, ready, go. Great job, and you already moved on to the next step. So the next step would be, I'd ask you, can you play more than one white key per time you go through that pattern? So can you play like maybe, or, so you're playing more than one different white key every time you do that. So let's do that. 1, 2, ready, go. Very good students on. And you can keep expanding these parameters as much as you like. You can have them also do black keys. It's nice to start with all white keys because that's all in the key of C. So the accompaniment I was playing was just simple kind of boom chuck polkas. On the 1 chord, the 5/7 chord. Okay, great, thanks. Actually, wait, no, you go back. I'm gonna ask someone else to go on to the next one. Before I move on to the next one, I want to talk about Piano Safari. So this is a really great method book. So when we're talking about beginners, if you want to use improvisation as a tool to teach beginning method, like rhythms, scales, arpeggios, really early stuff, 5-finger patterns, or just moving around the piano, Piano Safari really focuses on improvisation activities and also rote learning to get your student really comfortable with a lot of areas of the keyboard and a lot of different formal concepts. So that is a great source for that. And also even Piano Ventures, Faber and Faber has a lot of accompaniment where teacher can play with student to learn new things. All right, so next I want to talk about intermediate student. So this student is, I'd say, about middle school age. And what I'm trying to teach them in this theoretical situation is the 1, 4, 5/7 to 5, 5/7, 1 stock progression. This is something that we teach here in class piano. It's really helpful because it introduces this sound of the applied dominant. So we have, and then the 5/7 to 5. So it helps them start to get used to that, and that's going to be an on-ramp for them to modulate later on, which we'll talk about next. So to help the student, to reinforce this concept with the student, what I'm going to do is help them develop a little prelude out of this. So can I have another volunteer? Okay, yeah, yes. Brave soul. Right, great. So Daniel's about 13, 14. Can't you tell? It's obvious. Okay, so we're going to work this together. So we're going to let's talk about, okay, so this is our chord progression, right, we've been working on. And let's pick a key that you're familiar with.
C.
C? How about we go a little harder? How about we do G? I feel like you can handle G. I have also written down G. Perfect. So first, we want to make sure we understand what's going to be the chord for each one of these Roman numerals. So for key of G, we have G, and what's the 4 chord in G?
C.
And what's our 5 chord?
A.
No, first, so let's start with the 5 in the key of G.
Let me D.
Good. And then let's work backwards. What's the 5 chord of the 5? If we know the 5 chord is D, what's its 5? Good. Yeah. Exactly. And what are the notes in the A7 and the D7?
So A7 is gonna have A, C sharp, D.
And then G. Yeah, good. Right. We're doing dominant. Good. And then the D7 chord?
D, F sharp, A, C.
Good. Perfect. So you want to make sure your student knows what the chord tones are, because that's what they're going to target as they create this structure. Okay, so now that we have that, and if I was in a lesson, I'd probably have them write that out, just so they have all their available pitches in mind. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use this famous texture from Bach's Prelude in C major from the first Well-Tempered Clavier, and I got this example from Mortensen's The Pianist's Guide to Historic Improvisation. So we're going to use this texture, but we're going to take our harmonic progression and lay it over that. So to get started, let's look at what chord tones does he use to make this first shape? So we have C and E.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a C chord, what chord tones are those?
1 and 3.
Good, so it's the root and the third, and then what about in the right hand?
We have 5, 1 and 3.
Good, okay, so then if it's for C, what is that in G?
That would be, okay, so. So we have B, D, and then.
So we're gonna start with the root and the third, right? So that's GB. And then we have the sixth.
So then G, E.
Good. And can you play that in the rhythm? Cool. Great. So that's the first one. Now, how do we get to C from that?
G.
Yeah, we keep G. So B needs to change, right? There's no B's in the C chord. Yeah, so we're gonna move that to C. And then what about D? We can move that to E. You can keep G, and then this upper B needs to. Yeah, good. And keep playing this. Good. Great. So I walk the students through that, helping them find ways to move to the next chord. But the thing is we don't have to stick exactly with the way Bach laid out those chord tones. What this is really helpful for is mostly the rhythmic structure of things in the breakup. But we can totally try looping. So maybe we start and then if you want to shift it up, that would be an option. You can really try different things. So do you want to try playing into the A7 chord?
From G?
Yeah, try from G into A7. And then we'll move on to this. And then the C chord. Good. And then we're gonna need C sharps. But no A sharp. And then G natural. You had the G, beginning of the 7. Yeah. Good. Great. Thank you, Daniel. That's great. So, and you can so yeah, you use this, you take a structure, a figuration from a famous piece, something that you really like. There's a lot of great, like the Schubert Fantasy-Stücke have a lot of things you could take as well, or other preludes, and you have them reapply a new harmonic progression on there, and then give them the freedom to rearrange how those chord tones work out, and maybe even the figuration itself. All right, last example. I know it's getting a little late. I'll make this quick. We have our advanced student. They are getting ready for college, late high school, working on scales, virtuosity, arpeggios, and harder keys, getting faster and more comfortable with things. And you also want to keep building up their music theory understanding for those college level music theory courses. So what we're going to do is do a more complicated chord progression that I borrowed from The Art of Preluding we talked about earlier, and we're going to use it to teach them how to modulate, or one way to modulate, and also use it as a tool to build a toccata that they can practice their arpeggios on for these chords. So we go through the same process, we pick a key, and for this example, I decided to do E flat. Let's say maybe they're they're doing the famous, with the E flat scales. And so we're gonna keep working on E flat in that key area. And it's also more challenging, it's got a good mix of white and black keys. Then we'd walk through, there it is, okay. We walk through how to turn this chord progression into a chord progression in E flat. So this would be our 1 chord, 6, 7 and 5, 5, 5, 7. I also like to stretch out sometimes. I'll get them onto the 5 chord and then add the 5, 7, the 7th note, just to add length to it. And then after we get through this really establishes our key of the E flat. And then we're going to do a 2, 5, 1. But once we get to 2, we're going to turn that 2 into a major chord, which is going to become the 5 of our dominant related key. So I would walk that more slowly with students, but basically our progression will be E flat, E minor, A diminished, E flat. And then we continue with E flat. It's our minor 2. It's going to become major. We'll add the dominant 7 to give it a really good pull. So first we work through that together. We define the chord tones, make sure we know those, and then we have to pick a figuration. For this starting example, I think it's great to just have a bass. So left hand will just hold a bass octave with the root, and then right hand, let's do some kind of figuration of the triad. So it might sound like this. That gets us through to the 1 chord again. And in the minor 2. We need to change those A flats into A natural. That's going to get us modulating. This is a great time to teach that to your students. So through that, I changed A flats to A naturals. I added the E flat to give it a really strong dominant 7 feeling, and then we resolve into B flat. It's also great to teach them some melodic contours that help you resolve, like walking down from the 7 in your dominant 7 chord into the B flat gives it a nice resolution, so you're really convinced that you're in the key. And so you can develop all kinds of figurations and structures with that harmonic bass to help your student build their technique. You could even do like another one. You can break the chord into kind of like the famous Ave Maria texture. You could do figuration with both hands, maybe arpeggios intense. All kinds of, there are really so many options. But this is some ways to really get started improvising in the classical style in your lessons. Okay, I know I've gone a little over, just some final thoughts. So again, these are some really amazing resources I discovered. We talked about Cherney's work, CPE Bach, mostly chapter 7 talks about improv, but you can find helpful things throughout. We have Lawrence's The Pianist Guide to Historic Improvisation. My friend Zong introduced me to this. Is really, really excellent source. It has a chapter on building toccatas, on preludes, on ornamentation, really everything you could want to know to build your own works. The Piano Safari books and also video lectures by Robert Levin are super helpful to unpack this style. Finally, as a closing thought, I want to talk about improvising has this final strength as being a great tool to get your students to start playing in groups in chamber music. And even if you have students on different instruments, you can combine them together with this. All you really need is to create some beginning parameters. You can even do music by chance, where you maybe roll dice and say, okay, now we're all going to play quarter notes, or you're going to play in C and you're going to play in E flat. All these kind of games can be created, but it can get your students started to be comfortable playing with other instrumentalists before they're advanced enough to play true collaborative rep. Lastly, I just like to thank Dr. Lardy for all her help in helping me prepare this presentation, for all my wonderful grad student colleagues who've helped me along the way, and all the professors at the School of Music. Thank you. Do we have 2 questions now or anything? We're kind of over time.
I do have a question.
Oh,
When will you be performing we be performing like a recital solo side?
Yeah, I'll
recital?
do my solo recital hopefully in February. February, yeah, I'll be advertising that when it's soon. You guys can also all email me if you have any questions about any of these topics or you want to get to know more of the resources I talked about. And, oh yeah,
What
Dan.
originally got you interested in improvisation, in this idea?
Like the very first interest or like this topic
Like,
today?
what brought you to picking it for your topic today?
Yeah, I picked it for my topic because I really love playing classical and jazz. And I think it's so wonderful to be able to sit down and make stuff up at the keyboard. But if you, in a lot of lines of classical training, you just don't really get to develop that skill, or you have to leave classical music to do it, which I think is sad. Like you should be able to, like, it is a organic part of this music tradition, and you should be able to do it within that tradition and learn it there. You shouldn't have to go to jazz or pop or country or something else to learn that. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about like what that looks like. And I have a personal ambition to revive this. Like I've thought about maybe in future studios, teaching my students like how to improvise a piece before they perform their solo rep, things like that. So, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think it's a great topic and you did a great job, and it'd be really interesting to see the results as down the road. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but one sort of exception to the types of scenarios you talked about with classical musicians are organists, actually, who are often trained in improvisation, even polyphonic improvisation. So as you explore these further, that might be something to check out.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that. I remember I had a lot of organ friends in my undergrad, and they definitely worked on that stuff. Well, you may go.